What happened in that village changed everything, and few people know this story. This story could change the way you see Jesus forever. Imagine witnessing a miracle so great that it challenges everything you know about life and death. A story forgotten by time, but which reveals the immense power of the Son of God. Few know this story, but those who have heard it have never been the same. What you are about to discover is not only an extraordinary event, but living proof that Jesus has dominion over all things, including what the world considers impossible. In the next few minutes, you will be transported to a time where each day was full of mysteries, where faith and doubt walked side by side, where the name of Jesus echoed through the streets of towns and cities, awakening hope and at the same time causing fear. But before we proceed, stop for a moment and think. What would you do if you were faced with a situation where everything seemed lost? If you saw someone you love take their last breath, felt that deep pain of loss, and knew that nothing more could be done? This is a question that many have already asked themselves. After all, death seems to be the end. But is it really? Today, let's relive this impressive story together. A story of pain, faith, and a miracle so powerful that it forever changed the lives of everyone who witnessed that moment. The woman in this story is Miriam, a respected elderly woman in her village, known for her wisdom and unshakable faith. A mother, a grandmother, someone who spent decades trusting God, but now he was about to face what everyone fears, the end of his life. Death comes without warning. She doesn't wait for a last goodbye. She doesn't allow another word. She doesn't allow time for goodbyes. And when it arrives, it brings with it an unbearable weight, a pain that suffocates and paralyzes. But what if, just for a moment, would this story be different? If instead of death there was life? If instead of the end there was a new beginning? What if Jesus was there, at the very moment when everything seemed over? Stay with me until the end, because what you will hear today may transform the way you see the power of God. The burning sun of Galilee illuminates the surrounding hills, reflecting an intense gold on the stones that form the village's narrow paths. The heat raises a fine dust that mixes with the aroma of fresh dates and freshly baked bread coming out of the small clay ovens. The market is buzzing with the buzz of people negotiating, selling, buying, telling stories. A merchant's voice echoes in the distance, offering wine vinegar to season the day's meals. A group of children run barefoot between the stalls, laughing loudly, their simple robes fluttering with movement. Women hurry past, carrying clay jugs on their shoulders, heading to and from the village's central fountain. Some talk quietly, exchanging news about recent events. One name is mentioned repeatedly in people's whispers: Jesus of Nazareth. He passed through Capernaum last week, says an old man with a long grey beard, leaning on his staff. They say that a man possessed by an unclean spirit was freed with just one word. Another voice joins the dialogue. And the paralytic in Simon's house, he got up and walked. But who is this man? Asks a young merchant, frowning. How can you have so much power? Nobody knows for sure, replies an older man. Some say he is a great prophet. Others believe he is the Messiah himself. Words spread like the wind. The name of Jesus is on the lips of many, generating hope in some and fear in others. Religious leaders view this growing movement with suspicion. But among the common people, among peasants, fishermen, carpenters and widows, the mention of his name brings a mixture of admiration and curiosity. On the outskirts of the village, away from the noise of the market, there is a simple stone and mud house. The roof is flat, made of dry branches, and covered with a layer of sun-hardened clay. A rudimentary staircase leads to the top, where some aromatic herbs dry in the hot desert wind. The door, made of rustic wood, is ajar, and inside there is a heavy silence, interrupted only by whispers and the low sound of someone crying. Miriam lives in this house. She is a woman respected by the community, known for her kindness and the wise words she always offered to young people. For decades, she was a constant presence at village fairs, exchanging food and textiles, sharing advice with younger wives, telling stories to her neighbors' grandchildren. But now, his fragile body can no longer support the weight of the years. Age caught up with her, bringing with it weakness, exhaustion, and constant pain. Her son, Elias, a man with features hardened by time and work in the fields, sits next to her, holding her hand. His face shows concern, but he tries to remain calm. Beside him, his wife Hannah rests a pitcher of water on the wooden table. His eyes are red, swollen from suppressed crying. Miriam is lying on a simple mattress, made of straw and covered with worn fabric. Your breathing is slow, irregular. Sweat runs down his forehead, despite the hot wind blowing in through the small open window. His gaze, once full of life, now seems distant. "Elias," she murmurs shakily. "I'm here, Mom," he replies, squeezing her hand lightly. "I've lived a long time." His voice is weak but firm. "The Lord has sustained me all these years, and now I feel like my time has come." "Don't say that," Hannah whispers, holding back tears. "You will recover." Miriam smiles softly. "My daughter, all of our time comes one day." The silence that follows weighs like a rock on Elijah's chest. He knows his mother is right. He feels it, but the thought of losing her is unbearable. Outside, neighbors begin to gather. Some bring herbs and aromatic oils, a discreet preparation for what many already consider inevitable. The women whisper among themselves, exchanging sad looks. The men, more reserved, lower their heads, respecting the moment. An elderly woman approaches the house and touches Elias's arm. "Is there anything we can do?" He shakes his head, not knowing how to respond. What could be done? The healers have tried everything. Miriam lived a long life. Death is natural. It is part of the order of things. But deep down, in the depths of his soul, Elijah refuses to accept it. He looks around as if searching for a solution. Your eyes scan the crowd forming outside the house, searching for a familiar face, a sign, anything. Then, without thinking much, he whispers something to himself, almost without realizing it. "Essay." The words die in your mouth. He swallows hard, hesitantly. The thought that pops into your mind seems absurd, but at the same time, an ancient hope begins to grow within him, like a weak flame that resists the wind. What if Jesus were nearby? Your heart races. His gaze turns to the dusty road leading out of the village. He knows that Jesus has been going through towns and villages, healing the sick, restoring the crippled, even casting out demons. But could he do something for his mother? Would it be possible? Before Elias can say anything, one of the neighbors runs into the house, panting. His eyes are wide, as if he has seen something unbelievable. "Elijah," he exclaims, "you won't believe this." Elijah's heart races. What it was? The man takes a deep breath, trying to catch his breath. Jesus is coming here." Time seems to stop. The words echo in Elias's mind, pounding in his head. Jesus is coming. What does this mean? Could it be a sign? He stands up suddenly, feeling a lump form in his throat. Hannah looks at him, confused, but also with silent hope in her eyes. Outside, the buzz begins to increase. People start to come out of their houses, pointing at the road. Some whisper, others are running to try to get a better look. And then, in the distance, a figure appears. He walks calmly, with his gaze steady and compassionate. Their simple robes move gently in the warm afternoon wind. Behind him, the disciples follow in silence, as if they already knew that something special was about to happen. People make room, some holding their breath, others already murmuring words of praise. Elias feels his body shake. He knew that Jesus was powerful. He had already heard stories of his miracles, but now the Master was there, just a few steps from his home. What would happen next? After hearing this story, you will understand why some truths are so powerful that they need to be shared. There are miracles that have been forgotten by time, but that carry teachings that can transform lives. And today, you will meet one of them. So, before we continue, if you believe that miracles still happen, leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because here we explore rare and impactful stories about Jesus that few people know about. Now get ready, because what you're about to hear could change your view of faith forever. Miriam was once a woman full of life. In her youth, she walked those same dirt streets with vigor, carrying baskets of fresh dates, smiling at her neighbors, caring for those in need, sharing her wisdom with those who sought it. She never had riches, but she had something much more valuable, an unshakable faith. Since she was a little girl, she heard the stories of the ancient prophets, recited the sacred words, felt the power of God present in every sunset, in every successful harvest, in every baby cry that announced a new life. His heart always belonged to the Lord. Now, however, everything seemed different. His body, once strong and resilient, was weak, almost brittle. His bones ached with every movement. His eyes, before so attentive and full of light, were now lost in time. Tired, heavy, simple day-to-day tasks, which I used to perform with ease, have become impossible. Walking to the front door, getting up to get water, even talking took immense effort. And he knew his time was running out. She was not afraid of death. Never had. All his life, he prepared for the moment when he would return to the arms of the Creator. What broke his heart was not the thought of dying, but the thought of Elijah and Hannah, her beloved son, who still bore the marks of the difficulties they faced together when he was just a boy. Her daughter-in-law, who always took care of her as if she were her own mother. The love she felt for them was immense, but with each passing day she felt less able to express it. That morning, the sun had risen brightly, as it always did in Galilee. Golden light passed through the cracks in the house, illuminating the deep wrinkles on Miriam's face. She felt the heat on her face, but she didn't have the strength to get up. Everything seemed distant, as if it no longer completely belonged to that world. She heard footsteps, the familiar sound of Elijah's sandals grazing the stone floor. He walked over and knelt beside her, taking her hand gently, as if he were afraid of breaking it. "Mother." She opened her eyes slowly, forcing a weak smile. "I'm here, my son," Elijah swallowed. Since he was a boy, he always knew that his mother was a strong woman. He had never seen her lament. He had never seen her complain about life's difficulties. Even when everything seemed lost, Miriam found the strength to move forward. But now, here before him, she looked as fragile as a leaf about to be blown away by the wind. "You need to eat something," he said, trying to hide the pain in his voice. Miriam shook her head gently. "I'm not hungry, my son." Hannah, who was watching the scene from the other side of the small room, held back tears. She approached, touching Elias's shoulder gently. "Maybe some honey water." Miriam smiled. At her daughter-in-law, she was always a good wife to Elijah, careful, dedicated, patient. If there was anyone she could trust to take care of her son when she was gone, it was Hannah. "My daughter, you have always taken such good care of me," Miriam murmured, her voice barely audible. Hannah pursed her lips, forcing a smile that barely hid her sadness. "Because I love you, Mom." Silence took over the house for a moment. The only sound was the distant bird song outside and the rustle of the warm wind coming in through the window. Elias held his mother's hand tighter, feeling how cold it was, how fragile her fingers seemed, without the firmness they had before. Miriam closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Each time she did this, she felt as if her chest felt heavier, as if something inside her was slowly fading away. "Elias," he leaned in closer to hear her better. "The Lord has given me a long life. Maybe it's time for me to go." The words hit Elijah like a blow. He closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing the pain rising in his throat. How could he accept that? How could I just let her go? "Mom, please, don't talk like that." Miriam opened her eyes again and looked at him tenderly. "You need to be strong, my son. Elijah shook his head. He wanted to respond. He wanted to say that he wasn't ready, that he needed her, that it wasn't time yet. But the words didn't come out. He felt a knot tightening his chest, making it impossible to say anything. Hannah placed her hand on her husband's shoulder, trying to comfort him. Miriam turned her gaze to the window, observing the cloudless blue sky. "I trust God," she whispered. "If he wants me to stay, I will stay. But if it's my time, then I'm ready." That sentence, said with such serenity, broke something inside Elijah. He always knew that his mother was a woman of faith, but seeing her face her own death with such calm left him speechless. Outside the house, neighbors were already starting to arrive, bringing herbs and fabrics. News traveled fast. Everyone knew that Miriam didn't have much time. An older woman entered silently, carrying a small jar of aromatic oil. She looked at Elijah with a sad expression. "Maybe you should call the rabbi," she suggested quietly. Elijah did not respond. He didn't want to hear that. He didn't want to say goodbye. The truth was that he couldn't accept it. Miriam closed her eyes again. She felt the voices around her become more distant. He felt his breathing, getting weaker and weaker. Her body was exhausted, and for the first time she felt like maybe it really was time. But somewhere inside, a small hope still remained lit. She heard vaguely when one of the neighbors mentioned something outside. "They say Jesus is nearby." Those words, almost a whisper in the midst of sadness, made Elijah's heart quicken. Hannah looked at him, seeing his eyes widen. "Jesus," Elijah murmured. The name echoed in his mind like thunder. He looked at his mother again, seeing the tiredness in her eyes. But what if there was anyone in the world who could change that destiny? It was Jesus. The flame of hope within him was rekindled. Without thinking twice, he stood up suddenly, ignoring the gazes of his neighbors, ignoring the murmurs of the people around him. He couldn't just accept it, not without trying. If Jesus was around, so there was a chance. Miriam's breathing was becoming weaker and weaker. The small room, lit only by the golden rays of evening that streamed through the small window, felt suffocating. The silence was broken only by the soft sound of her ragged breathing and the rustling of fabrics as Hannah tried to adjust the straw pillows beneath her head. Elias held his mother's hand, feeling the cold that slowly took over his wrinkled fingers. His eyes filled with tears, but he fought to keep them from falling. Time seemed to drag on painfully. Miriam opened her eyes with difficulty, looking at her son's face, a look full of love and farewell. She knew he wasn't ready to let her go, but what could you do? His body was tired, his soul was exhausted. The life God gave her was long, full of challenges and moments of joy, but now she felt that her journey was coming to an end. And then, with an effort that required her last strength, she murmured, almost soundlessly, "My son, trust in the Lord." Elias held her hand tighter, as if that gesture could prevent the inevitable. His throat was dry. His mind refused to accept what his eyes witnessed. "Mom, don't leave us," he whispered, his voice trailing off at the end of the sentence. Neighbors, who were outside the house, began to approach. Some entered silently, respectfully, knowing that this moment was sacred. The older women brought jars of aromatic oils, preparing for the final tribute. Hannah, on her knees beside her mother-in-law, held a thin, clean cloth, ready to cover her face as soon as life left her. But inside, she fought despair. His heart cried out for a miracle, but his reason told him that the miracle would not come. Miriam closed her eyes. The sound around him began to fade. His breathing became even more shallow, almost imperceptible. His skin, which once carried the warmth of the sunny days of Galilee, now looked cold, pale. Time froze, and then the last breath, a faint breath, a small movement of the chest, and nothing more. Silence fell over the house. For a moment, no one moved. Hannah put her hand over her mouth, trying to contain the tears that threatened to escape. Elijah felt his world fall apart. He remained still, looking at his mother, waiting for a miracle that didn't happen. Outside, the wailing began. The women pulled their veils over their heads, bowing in mourning. Some began to sing low chants, a sad melody that echoed like a whisper through the village. The men walked away respectfully, knowing that this was the moment to say goodbye. Hannah, with shaking hands, took the fabric and gently covered Miriam's face. Elijah closed his eyes tightly. His chest rose and fell rapidly, trying to control the overwhelming pain that burned inside him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to protest against heaven. He wanted to demand an explanation from God. Why? Why so fast? Why did your mother, a woman of faith, of kindness, of service, have to leave like that? The surrounding voices seemed distant. He barely noticed when one of the neighbors placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring words of comfort. All he could hear was the sound of his own heart beating, too fast, too heavy, the smell of the perfumed oil that they began to pour over Miriam's body, mixed with the warm, late afternoon air. Elias felt everything, but at the same time, nothing made sense. He lowered his head, squinting his eyes, trying to find some answer, but there was only emptiness. Hannah sobbed softly beside him. She tried to be strong, but her body was shaking with emotion. Outside, the village was preparing for the farewell ritual. The men began to gather the wooden planks to carry the body to the burial place. In their tradition, there was no time to prolong mourning. The dead had to be buried on the same day, but Elijah couldn't move. He looked at his mother, as if he expected that at any moment she would open her eyes again, smile at him, tell him everything was fine. But that didn't happen. There were no more miracles. Or at least, that's what he thought. That was when a distant sound reached his ears. The village's buzz has changed. There was a sudden silence, followed by hurried whispers. Hurrying footsteps resounded outside the house. And then, the name. A name that made Elijah's heart stop for a moment. Jesus. Someone ran up to the house almost out of breath and shouted, "Jesus is here!" Time seemed to stop again. Elijah looked up, his eyes wide. Hannah looked at him, surprised, not knowing what to think. Outside, people began to move around, some running towards the entrance to the village, others just muttering among themselves, unsure of what this meant. Elijah felt his heart race. Jesus! What could this mean? He barely noticed when he stood up, as if his feet were moving on their own. His hands were shaking, his breathing was ragged. Would it be possible? His gaze returned to his mother's body, motionless, covered by the thin fabric. He felt hope and fear colliding within him. If Jesus really was there, if he had come to that village just at that moment, so maybe it wasn't too late, but he needed to act quickly. If there was any chance that a miracle could happen, he couldn't waste it. Elias hurriedly left the house, pushing past the people in front of him. He ran down the dirt street, the sun setting behind the hills, painting the sky orange and purple. His eyes swept the crowd, searching for a figure he had never seen in person, but knew from the stories that ran through every city. And then he saw him. A figure walked calmly along the village's entrance. Road, a man in simple clothes, his tunic dusty from travel, but his eyes seemed to see everything. Elias felt his legs weaken for a moment, but he had no time for hesitation. He gathered all the strength he had left in his body and shouted, his voice echoing throughout the village, "Sir, please come, my mother." He couldn't finish it. Jesus stopped. His gaze turned to Elijah, fixating on him for a moment that seemed like an eternity. And then he started walking towards her. What would happen now? Now I want to hear from you. If Jesus were passing through your city, what would you do? Would you call for him? Would you believe that a miracle is still possible? Comment below, "I would call for Jesus," and tell me what you think will happen next. The noise of the village grew as Jesus approached. People who had previously mourned and cried were now torn between sadness and surprise. Some ran to see him up close, while others whispered among themselves, wondering why he had come. Elias felt his heart beating hard in his chest, his legs trembling with the mix of hope and fear. He had never seen Jesus in person, but he had heard stories about him. Stories of impossible cures, of paralytics who walked, of blind people who saw again, of men tormented by evil spirits who were freed with a single word. But his mother was already dead. Death was the end. It was definitive. Still, he couldn't ignore the small flame of hope that burned inside him. Jesus walked calmly, his disciples close behind. The setting sun cast a golden light upon his garments. The dust of the road rose softly beneath his bare feet. His countenance was serene, but there was something about his presence that made even the most skeptical hold their breath. He didn't seem surprised, he didn't seem rushed, and that made even more of an impact. He already knew what was happening there. Peter, who was walking beside him, looked at the crowd and frowned. He watched the sad faces, the tears, the murmurs. Then he turned to Jesus and asked, "Master, what happened?" Jesus did not stop walking, his gaze fixed on Elias's house, where Miriam's body lay covered in a thin cloth. His tone was calm, but his words echoed like thunder in the minds of those around him. "She is not dead, just sleep." The crowd held its breath. Some looked at him in amazement, others frowned, uncomfortable with the statement. Murmurs began to quickly spread among those present. "What do you mean, sleep?" "I saw it myself when she took her last breath," said one of the neighbors, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's too late," murmured another man. "If he had come sooner, perhaps he would have done something. But now, what can he do against death?" A woman looked at Elijah, seeing his face filled with anguish and internal conflict. "It doesn't make sense. She has already been prepared for burial. The body is cold." The words began to take on a different connotation. From surprise, they turned to disdain. Muffled laughter began to erupt from the crowd. Some looked at Jesus with scorn, shaking their heads as if he were a deluded man. "That's not possible. Death is the end. He can heal, but bring someone back? This has never been seen." The words were harsh, but Jesus did not react. He just kept walking. His gaze remained calm, unchanged, as if he knew something that no one else knew, as if the truth was already written and he was just there to reveal it. Elijah, however, didn't care what they said. His breathing was ragged, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't contain. He couldn't explain it. But when he looked at Jesus, he felt something different. It wasn't just hope, it was certainty. Without hesitation, he fell to his knees, his hands shaking, his voice cracking with emotion. "Lord, if there is anything you can do, I believe it." His words cut through the air like a blade. Silence took over the place. Everyone was looking at him now. A grown man kneeling on the ground, begging not for something small, not for simple relief, but for an impossible miracle. Jesus stopped before him. The dust raised by walking settled around his feet. The wind blew gently, moving the folds of his robe. Their piercing eyes fell on Elijah as if they were seeing not just his pain, but everything inside him. His doubts, his fears, his struggle to believe. Hannah approached slowly, her face bathed in tears, not knowing whether to speak or remain silent. Jesus then raised one of his hands and touched Elijah's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but loaded with something that no one there could explain. It was as if, in that touch, all the weight that Elijah carried had been ripped away. "Get up," Jesus said. Elias felt a wave of heat run through his body. It was something he had never experienced before, a profound relief, as if an invisible force was holding him and lifting him from within. He obeyed. He got up, still shaking, still with tears in his eyes. Jesus then looked at the house. The murmurs started again. What does he intend to do? This is crazy. He can't be serious. But there was something in the way Jesus looked at that house, something in the tranquility that emanated from him, that made even the most skeptical people hesitate. Peter, who was still observing everything, exchanged a quick look with the other disciples. He had already seen Jesus do extraordinary things. He knew that when Master looked like that, something was about to happen. Jesus began walking toward the house. The crowd pushed through, but disbelief was still evident on the faces of many. Some followed behind, curious to see where it would go. Others walked away, shaking their heads, convinced that nothing could be done. Elijah and Hannah exchanged a quick look before running into the house. Inside, the atmosphere was completely different. The air filled with sadness, the smell of sacred oils, Miriam's body covered in white fabric. The reality was there. She was dead. Hannah held Elijah's arm, her body shaking with emotion. Part of her wanted to believe, wanted to hold on to the hope that grew with every step Jesus took toward them. But another part, the logical part, the part that had seen others die, whispered that it was too late. Jesus stopped at the doorstep. The environment was cold. The wails had ceased, replaced by the silent presence of the impossible. He took another step. Hannah held her breath. Elijah felt his chest tighten. Outside, the crowd huddled together waiting, some for a miracle, others for a failure. Jesus then spoke his words, words that would be engraved in everyone's minds forever. She's not dead, just sleep. The impact of his words echoed like thunder inside that house. Hearts raced, the eyes widened, and for a moment time seemed to stop. What would happen now? Was death really the end? Or were they all about to witness something that challenged everything they knew about life? Now tell me, if you were there, would you believe it? Comment below, I believe in the power of Jesus, and tell me what you think will happen next. The entire house fell into a sepulchral silence. The air, thick with myrrh and sacred oils, seemed to weigh heavily on the shoulders of everyone inside. Miriam's body, covered by the thin white fabric, remained motionless on the straw bed. The golden evening light streamed through the window, illuminating the anxious faces of Elijah and Hannah, who stood close together, their eyes fixed on Jesus. They didn't dare speak. They didn't even dare to breathe louder. The world seemed to have stopped at that moment, as if everything around was waiting for what would happen next. Outside, the crowd was gathering. People of all ages craned their necks, trying to see what was happening inside that house. Some held their hands over their lips, anxious. Others crossed their arms, skeptical. The disbelief was almost palpable in the air. The whispers, which were previously discreet, were now muffled by a fear that slowly grew within each one. He said she's not dead, muttered a woman outside. But how? I saw it myself when she took her last breath. This is crazy. He can heal the sick but bring someone back from the dead. We've never heard of that. The murmurs stopped when Jesus began to move. He walked slowly through the small room, the wood of the floor creaking slightly beneath his feet. His eyes were fixed on Miriam's inert body. There was no rush in his movements, no hesitation. What would he do now? Elias held Hannah's arm tightly, feeling his wife shiver beside him. His heart was racing. He wanted to believe. I needed to believe. But the fear that nothing would happen was overwhelming. Jesus approached the bed. His presence was strong, enveloping, filling every corner of that humble house. The evening light illuminated his serene features, his eyes that seemed to see beyond human reality. He then reached out and touched Miriam's cold fingers. The crowd held its breath. Elijah felt a shiver run down his spine. That touch, it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Miriam's hands were cold, lifeless, as if the heat had dissipated from them a long time ago. But Jesus did not back down. He held her fingers gently, as if holding something precious, something that hadn't yet been completely lost. And then, with a soft yet firm voice, he spoke the words that would change everything. Miriam, get up. The silence inside the house became absolute. Time stopped, and then a slight movement, so subtle that for a moment Elias thought it was just his imagination, but then it happened again. Miriam's fingers twitched. Hannah let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hands. His entire body was shaking. Elijah's eyes were wide. His heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The murmurs outside increased. What was that? Did you see? She moved. And then the unthinkable happened. Miriam's eyes opened. Elias staggered back, almost off balance. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Outside, a cry of astonishment ran through the crowd, spreading like fire through dry straw. Miriam blinked a few times, as if trying to get used to the light that she was now seeing again. His eyes, previously dull, now shone with something new, something that no one there could describe in words. She took a deep breath, as if she was sucking in the air of life for the first time. And then his voice, shaky but clear, filled the space. I was in a place of peace, but now I see the light again. Elijah fell to his knees. Hannah cried openly, unable to control her emotion. The crowd outside erupted in screams and exclamations. Some people ran towards the house, others fell to the ground, too shocked to react. Some began praising God, while others just stared, unable to process what they were witnessing. Inside the house, Miriam moved her hands slowly, feeling the heat returning to her body. She turned her face to the side, her eyes meeting Jesus's, and then something incredible happened. She smiled. It was a soft smile, but full of meaning. There was no fear in his eyes, there was no confusion, just peace. Jesus returned the look without saying a word, but he didn't need to say anything. Everyone there knew what had happened. The impossible had become possible. The miracle was before his eyes. Outside, some were crying with emotion, while others were desperately trying to understand. How is this possible? She was dead. I saw. This man has power over death itself. Elijah was finally able to move. He walked up to his mother and cupped her face with shaking hands. Mom, is that really you? Miriam smiled at him, touching his face affectionately. Yes, my son. God brought me back. Hannah fell beside them, holding her mother-in-law's hand, tears streaming down her face. And then Miriam's eyes turned to Jesus again. She knew. She felt it. She had understood everything. Jesus smiled slightly, and then, without saying anything else, he turned to the crowd that was still in shock outside. Some were already on their knees. Others were looking at him with tears in their eyes. News of that miracle would travel quickly. Soon, distant cities would know what happened there. Soon, the religious authorities would hear about this. But at that moment, nothing else mattered. Just the miracle. Just the absolute power of Jesus over death. Just the restored faith of a family that had just seen the impossible happen before their eyes. And then, as if everything was predestined, a gentle breeze entered the house, shaking the flames of the lamps, moving the folds of Jesus' robe. And deep down, Elijah knew nothing would be the same again. Now I want to hear from you. If you were there, what would your reaction be? Would you believe or doubt? Comment below. I believe in the impossible. And tell me what you felt when reading this miracle. The house was still enveloped in absolute silence. It was as if time had stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath at what had just happened. Miriam was sitting, alive, breathing, talking. The evening light reflected off his newly opened eyes, which now seemed more alive than ever. Elias still held her hand, unable to let go, as if he feared that if he blinked, everything would disappear like a dream. Hannah cried silently, pressing her fingers to her lips, trying to contain the overwhelming emotion that overwhelmed her. Outside, the crowd was divided between shock and ecstasy. Some still couldn't process what they had just witnessed. Others threw themselves on the ground, murmuring praises to God. Among the amazed faces, there were also those who, even when faced with the impossible, did not want to believe it. This is witchcraft, someone muttered. It can't be true. There must be some explanation, said another, although his eyes betrayed the fear of what he himself had witnessed. But no one dared to speak too loudly. The weight of Jesus' presence was too strong, too dense. He was there, standing, still looking at Miriam with a serene expression, but at the same time filled with something indescribable. It was as if he saw something that no one else saw. Then, slowly, Jesus looked up at the crowd. His eyes roved over people's faces, watching their hearts, feeling their thoughts. He knew who they believed, who doubted, who was still, trying to find human reasons for what was divine. The silence was interrupted by his voice. "Whoever believes, even if he dies, will live." The words were spoken calmly, but the force of them was overwhelming. Elijah felt a shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just about Miriam. It wasn't just about that miracle. It was about something much bigger, something that surpassed human understanding. Jesus took a step forward, and the crowd instinctively moved back a little. The respect, the reverence, the mystery of his presence meant that no one dared to stay too close. "Faith can move mountains," he continued. And then, looking directly at Miriam, he asked, "Tell me, Miriam, where have you been?" The elderly woman blinked a few times, seeming to still get used to the fact that she was there again, breathing, feeling the heat of her own body. His voice was low, but clear enough for everyone to hear. I was in a place of peace." She paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "There was no pain, there was no fear. I felt a presence, an indescribable love. But then a voice called me, and when I opened my eyes, I was here." Miriam's words sent chills down the spines of many who were there. Some exchanged nervous glances, others just closed their eyes, absorbing the meaning of what she said. Jesus nodded slightly. "I didn't bring her back because death has power over her. I brought her back because faith has more power than death itself." He then turned to the crowd. "You cried because you believed the end had come, but I tell you, death is not the end for those who believe." Elias felt the impact of those words like a punch to the chest. How many times had he heard about faith? How many times had he listened to the scriptures, heard the rabbis talk about God's promise? But now he saw that promise alive before his eyes. His mother, who had left, was now breathing again. How could I doubt? How could I question? But there were still those who resisted. An older man, one of the most influential in the village, frowned and crossed his arms. "But, Master," he began, trying to keep his voice steady but unable to hide the tremor, "if the Lord has this power, why doesn't everyone return? Why isn't everyone saved from death?" Jesus turned his gaze to him. "Because faith is not about earthly life. Faith is about eternity." The weight of that sentence made the man swallow hard. "Whoever believes in me," Jesus continued, "will never die. Even if his body fails, his soul will live. You mourn for the dead, but I tell you, God is the God of the living and not of the dead." That statement was like a blade cutting through the disbelief of many. Miriam looked at Elijah and Hannah, and for the first time since waking, tears rolled down her wrinkled face. "I saw the truth," she whispered. "I know God is real. I know his promise is true." Elias held his mother's hand, feeling how warm she was now, how her skin had life again. Hannah threw herself into her mother-in-law's arms, sobbing. Outside, some people began to kneel. Others simply stood there, silent, letting Jesus' words sink into their hearts. The meaning of that miracle went beyond Miriam's resurrection. He showed something that everyone there needed to understand, that faith was capable of overcoming any barrier, that no matter how definitive something seemed, God always had the final say, that the fear of death should not dominate those who trusted in him. And then Jesus took one last look at Miriam and said, "Live your life as a testimony of what you have seen. May your faith guide others to the truth." Miriam nodded, and this time her smile was even stronger. She understood. She knew. She had a new mission. Elias ran his hand over his face, still trying to process everything. He looked at the crowd, at the people who now looked at Jesus with a mixture of fear and reverence. Outside the village, the sun was already starting to set, dyeing the sky with orange and red tones. The wind blew gently, bringing with it a feeling of renewal, as if even nature recognized that something great had just happened there. Miriam was alive. But more than that, something even greater had been born that day, a faith that could never be shaken again. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something that strengthened your faith? Have you ever witnessed a miracle? Comment below. My faith moves mountains. And share your experience. The shock spreading through the village was almost palpable. The impossible had happened before everyone's eyes, but not everyone was ready to accept what they had just witnessed. Miriam's breathing filled the small room like the most unbelievable sound anyone could hear at that moment. The eyes of the crowd went from Jesus to the woman who, moments before, was dead. The weight of the miracle was so overwhelming that for a moment no one knew what to do. Then, as if something invisible broke over them, the first reactions began to emerge. There was a cry of surprise, then another, and then a woman at the back of the crowd fell to her knees on the dirt floor, covering her face with her hands, sobbing, unable to contain the impact of what she saw. She cried not only because of the miracle itself, but because deep in her heart she understood what it meant. He is the Messiah. His voice was shaky, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to be heard by those closest to him. An elderly man, who until that moment had remained with his arms crossed, trying to understand everything logically, shook his head and muttered softly, "This cannot be the work of one man. This power comes from God himself." And then, one by one, others began to kneel. Some fell to the ground, prostrating themselves, touching their foreheads to the dust in an act of total surrender. Others just looked up, tears streaming down their faces as they murmured prayers. But in the midst of the ecstasy that took over the crowd, there were those who still hesitated. Not everyone was ready to accept what they were seeing. In the background, near the stone houses that surrounded the village, two men in dark robes observed the scene with closed expressions. Their gazes were attentive, evaluating every detail, every reaction. They did not mingle with the people, they did not kneel, they did not murmur words of worship. They just watched. The Pharisees, men who had dedicated their lives to the law, who spent their days studying the scriptures, who knew every detail of the Torah and taught the people how they should live. But at that moment, what they saw before them bothered them deeply. It wasn't just the miracle itself. It was the fact that so many people were beginning to see Jesus as something more than just a man. The whispers between them were low, but filled with concern and indignation. "This is dangerous," one of them muttered, eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. "If the people continue to believe in him, we will lose control over them." The other Pharisee frowned, his fingers tightening the fabric of his robes. "The Romans will not accept a revolt. If this man continues to draw crowds, he will become a threat." But unlike the crowd who were ecstatic and worshipful, the Pharisees did not speak loudly. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves. They wanted to observe, to understand, wait for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, inside Miriam's house, Elias still held his mother's hand as if he feared she would disappear again. His heart was still beating fast. His eyes were still wide, unable to blink for long. Hannah sobbed softly, holding herself back from completely collapsing. And, through it all, Miriam just smiled. The smile of someone who understood the magnitude of what had happened. The smile of someone who knew they had experienced something that would change their life forever. Jesus, however, did not turn to the crowd immediately. He remained looking at Miriam for a few more moments, his eyes filled with something that no one else could decipher. And then, calmly, he took a step back. It was only at this moment that people started moving again. A man who had been doubtful before approached the house hesitantly. He stopped at the door, looked at Miriam, then at Jesus, and then murmured, I don't understand." His eyes were full of conflict. He wanted to believe, but something inside him resisted. Jesus looked at him, saying nothing for a moment. Then he just replied, "Blessed are they who have not seen, but have believed." The sentence hit the man like a blow. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. He just lowered his head, seeming lost in thought. And then another voice came, a different voice, a voice filled with disbelief and contempt. That was just coincidence. The crowd turned to see who was speaking. He was a tall man with a rigid posture, one of the local religious leaders. His face was serious, his eyes narrowed. He didn't seem impressed nor touched by what had happened. "I've seen people who appeared to be dead come back to life," he continued. "It doesn't mean this man has power over death." An uncomfortable silence took over the place. Some of Jesus' followers looked at him, waiting for him to respond. Others just frowned, irritated by the religious leader's words. But Jesus didn't seem bothered. He just turned his gaze to the man and asked, "Do you believe that God has power over life?" The man frowned, clearly bothered by the question. "Of course, we all know that." Jesus nodded. "So why are you surprised when God decides to give life back to whoever he wants?" The man didn't know what to answer. The crowd murmured among themselves. Some smiled, understanding the depth of Jesus' words. Others just remained silent, reflecting. The tension between those who believed and those who doubted was still strong. But one thing was certain: no one would leave there being the same as before. News of this miracle would travel fast. The news that Jesus not only healed, but also had power over death itself. And those who saw it would never forget what happened that day. What would come next? How would the Pharisees react? What would Miriam do now that she had returned from the impossible? What did this miracle mean within Jesus' great mission? Miriam's breathing was still labored. She looked around, taking in everything as if she was seeing her own home for the first time. The emotional faces, the eyes wide with disbelief, the whispers of amazement. Elias held her hand tightly, as if he were afraid of letting go and losing her again. Hannah was still crying, unable to contain the tears that streamed down her face. The weight of the miracle was so great that words seemed small compared to what had just happened. The entire village was motionless. Expressions of shock and awe were on the faces of people still trying to process what they had witnessed. Some were on their knees, muttering low prayers. Others just watched, as if they expected Miriam to disappear before their eyes at any moment. But she didn't disappear. It was there, breathing, alive. The silence seemed to stretch beyond time, until finally, with a visible effort, Miriam raised her voice, breaking the stillness of the moment. "I saw the darkness." Their eyes were distant, as if they still saw something that no one else could see. But then I felt a voice calling me back, a voice full of love. A shiver ran through those nearby. His words were not just an ordinary report. They were a testimony to something that no one else there could fully understand. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, and then continued. "At first, everything was dark, a deep void without sound, without form, without time. There was no pain, but there was also nothing, just a feeling of being far, far away from here. But then," she hesitated for a moment, as if searching for words that could describe something indescribable. "I felt a warmth, a presence. It was like I was being enveloped by something bigger than myself. And then I heard that voice. It wasn't just a sound, it was life. It was like every part of me was called back, like something inside me was rekindled. And when I opened my eyes, I was here." Hannah sobbed. Elias pursed his lips, trying to contain his emotion. Outside, the crowd murmured among themselves. Some people looked at each other, trying to understand what Miriam was saying. Others simply listened, absorbing every word. "I felt peace," she continued. "But when that voice called me, I knew I had to come back. And now I understand. I didn't come back just for me. I came back because God hasn't finished his work in my life yet." One of the neighbors, an elderly man with a long beard and a weathered face, leaned forward, his voice filled with curiosity and fear. "What was that voice, Miriam?" She looked at Jesus. "I know it was him," he replied firmly. A deep silence took over the place. Jesus said nothing. He just looked at Miriam with a slight smile, and then she turned her gaze to everyone around her. "I've always believed in God," he continued, "but now I understand that faith is not just believing. Faith is trusting even when we can't see the way, even when all seems lost, even when darkness surrounds us." Her words penetrated deep into the hearts of the people around. It was as if everyone there was, reliving their own doubts, their own fears, their own moments of despair. A woman who was standing at the back of the crowd put her hand to her chest, tears in her eyes. "I've always been afraid of death," he confessed, his voice breaking. "But now I don't know what to think anymore." Miriam looked at her tenderly. "Death is not the end," he said. "I know that now." The whispers grew louder. Some people nodded slowly, as if Miriam's words were opening something inside them. Still others seemed confused, trying to reconcile everything they had just witnessed with their own beliefs and experiences. Elijah, who until then had remained silent, finally found his voice. "Mum," he paused, swallowing hard. "What do you think God wants you to do now?" Miriam looked at her son, and a new shine appeared in her eyes. "I need to tell this story," he replied. "People need to know that God is real, that he never abandons us, even in the darkest moments." Elijah's eyes filled with tears. The crowd began to move, some moving closer, others murmuring among themselves. Some were still in shock, while others seemed to be processing the truth before them. The Pharisees, who were further away, exchanged worried looks. This miracle could not be ignored. Jesus, who until then had only been observing, took a step forward. He looked around as if he was reading the thoughts of everyone there. "Faith does not depend on what you see," he said, "but on what you believe, even when you cannot see." Miriam's eyes lit up. She understood. And at that moment, many others understood as well. The impact of what had just happened would not be restricted to that village. This story would spread. People from other cities would come to hear about the day a woman came back from the dead and testified to the truth. And Jesus knew this. He knew this was just the beginning. The fine dust of the road still hung in the air as Jesus stood before the crowd, his serene gaze crossing every face, every astonished look, every heart that was still trying to understand what had happened. Miriam was alive. The impossible had become possible, and no one could ever deny what they witnessed that day. But while many were still deep in thought, trying to process the miracle before them, Jesus seemed to already know it was time to leave. His purpose there was fulfilled. And then, without rushing, but with the certainty of someone who knows the way, Jesus began to walk away. His steps were light on the dry soil of the village. The wind lightly blew the folds of his clothes. Peter, John, and the other disciples exchanged glances with each other before they began to follow him. They knew that Jesus would not stay in one place for long, as there were still many who needed to hear him, many who needed to see to believe, many who still lived in darkness and needed the light. But before he could go too far, an emotion-filled voice cut through the air. "Sir!" Elias. He was still on his knees beside his mother, tears streaming down his face. His body shook no longer with pain, but with gratitude. He knew that nothing he said would be enough to express how he felt. How could I thank you? How could he put into words what was forever engraved in his soul? But Jesus stopped. He turned his face slightly, giving Elijah a look that said more than any words could. Elias felt a deep warmth in his chest, as if he had just heard the answer to all his questions, as if Jesus already knew everything he wanted to say, everything he felt. And then the master just smiled. It was a simple smile, but filled with something that no one else in the world could offer. It was the smile of someone who understood pain, but who had power over it. It was the smile of someone who knew the hearts of men and yet loved them without reservation. And with that, he walked again. Elias felt his legs weak, but he found the strength to stand up. Hannah, at her side, held Miriam's hand, who now watched Jesus walk away. With teary eyes but full of peace, she took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs in a way she never thought she would again. And then, without hesitation, she did what she knew she needed to do. She took a step forward, and then another. His body, which had previously been weak, tired, consumed by illness and the weight of years, now moved lightly. With each step, she felt her strength renewed. She felt life pulsing through her veins. She felt that she had been brought back by in purpose. And when he realized he was already running towards Jesus, the crowd parted ways, watching in disbelief as the woman who moments before lay lifeless now crossed the village with the speed of a child. Some covered their mouths with their hands, others fell to their knees when they saw her run, because at that moment they understood that they were facing something much bigger than they could understand. And when Miriam finally approached, Jesus stopped once again. She fell at his feet, clutching the hem of his robe, tears falling heavily onto the dirt floor. "Thank you," she whispered between sobs. Jesus bent down slightly, touching the top of her head with his hand. "Get up, Miriam," he said tenderly. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. And there, in that look, she understood everything. He understood that his life would never be the same again. She understood that that moment was not just about her, but about everyone who was there, about everyone who would hear her story, about everyone who needed to know that God was real, that God saw, that God heard, that God had power over everything, even death. Miriam nodded, wiping away her tears. She stood up, feeling her heart filled with something new, something that would never leave her again. And then, without needing any more words, Jesus walked again. This time, no one dared to stop him. No one tried to question him. Everyone just stood there watching until he and his disciples disappeared over the horizon. The silence that followed was profound. Not a silence of uncertainty, but a silence of reverence. The entire village stood there, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. What did all this mean? What would happen now? What would they do after seeing something that could never be denied? Some knelt, praying quietly. Others hugged each other, still trying to understand. Some began to cry again, but no longer with sadness. Now, the tears were of gratitude. Elias turned to his mother and hugged her tightly. He didn't need to say anything. Hannah did the same. The world as they knew it had changed forever. And then someone murmured, "What would I have done if I had been there?" The question hung in the air like a whisper on the wind. If you had been there, seeing the impossible happen before your eyes, what would your reaction have been? Would you have believed it immediately? Or would I have doubted? Would you have fallen to your knees and worshipped? Or would he have tried to find rational explanations for what was clearly supernatural? Many in that village would ask themselves that question in the days to come. Some would be marked by the miracle for the rest of their lives. Others would try to forget it, fearing what it meant. But the truth was one: Jesus passed by, and no one would ever be the same. Now tell me, if you had been there, what would your reaction have been? Would you have knelt down or tried to understand with reason? Comment below. I recognize the power of Jesus and share your answer with me. The town was slowly returning to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. The voices were still quieter than usual. People moved as if they were in some sort of silent trance, trying to process what their eyes had witnessed. There was a weight in the air, not a weight of sadness, but of something much greater, a weight of reflection, of transformation. Miriam was alive, not because the village doctors found a cure for his illness, not because his family managed to prevent his death, but because Jesus brought her back, and that changed everything. What happened that day could never be erased from the memory of those who were present. The initial shock, the fear, the disbelief, all of this now gave way to something much deeper, the understanding that they had witnessed the impossible. And now, What did this miracle mean? Why did Jesus do this? Was it just about Miriam, about Elijah and Hannah, or was there something much bigger involved? The answer was there all along. In the words Jesus had said, "He who believes, even if he dies, will live." Faith can move mountains. Those words echoed in Elijah's mind as he stood next to his mother, still holding her warm, living hands. He looked at her face and felt like he was seeing her for the first time. What did it mean to have faith? All his life Elijah believed in God, but did he really trust? Because that day, he almost gave up. When Miriam stopped breathing, when he saw the life drain from her body, something inside him died too. He felt the pain of loss, felt the weight of despair crushing his heart, and for a moment, he gave in to fear. But then came hope. The moment he knew Jesus was coming, everything changed within him. A spark lit up in his chest, a voice whispered that it wasn't the end yet, and he ran, he knelt, he cried out, and his faith was answered. Because that's what faith does. Faith does not ignore pain, faith does not deny difficulties. But faith says, I don't need to understand everything, I just need to trust. That story wasn't just about Miriam's resurrection, it was about something much bigger. It was a reminder that God never abandons us, that the impossible does not exist for those who trust in the Lord, that miracles still happen, but only to those who believe in them. How many times in our lives have we found ourselves in Elijah's shoes? How many times do we feel like we are about to lose something or someone we love? How many times do we look at a situation and think, it's over, there's no solution anymore? And how often in these moments do we forget to call on Jesus? Many of us believe in God, but do we really trust Him when all seems lost? Do we have the courage to keep believing when the world around us says there is no more hope? Miriam's story is living proof that when God wants, nothing can stop His actions. Not the time, not even death, not logica humana. God is not limited to the rules of the world He created. If He wants to part a sea for His people to pass through, He will. If He wants to make a blind man see, He will do it. If He decides that someone who is gone must come back, that person will come back. But there is a secret to all this. The secret is faith. Those who were in the village that day and doubted never experienced this miracle like Elijah and Hannah did. The Pharisees, who were there just observing, trying to understand logic, left with nothing. But those who threw themselves at the feet of Jesus, those who chose to believe even without understanding, these were transformed forever. And now I ask you, does this story mean something to you? Does it stir something inside you? Because if it moves, maybe it's because God wants to talk to you. Maybe He is reminding you of something you have already forgotten. Maybe He is telling you to trust Him more. Maybe He is trying to open your eyes to something you don't want to see. Or maybe, like Miriam, He is calling you back. Do you feel like God is calling you? Do you feel like there is something happening inside you as you listen to this story? If you feel it, then don't ignore this call. Because God still performs miracles. God still resurrects what we thought was lost, and God is still waiting for you to trust Him. Miriam's story will be marked forever, not just for Elijah, Hannah, and the residents of that village, but for everyone who hears about this miracle. Because something like this cannot be ignored, cannot be forgotten, cannot simply be treated as another event from the past. Miracles like this defy logic, break barriers and transform lives. They force us to look beyond what our eyes can see, to believe even when everything seems contrary. Miriam came back to life. Jesus showed once again that faith can move mountains. But the truth is that this wasn't the only time the impossible became reality. This was not the only time death lost its power. This was not the only time Jesus shocked a crowd by defying the laws of nature. What if I told you that there were other miracles as impressive as this one? Hidden stories, little-known stories, moments that few have access to, but that reveal even more about the power of Jesus. I'm sure this story touched you, so you need to see the next miracle I'm going to tell you. Because if you think you've seen it all, you're wrong. There are miracles of Jesus that have been forgotten by time, but that carry powerful messages that can transform your life, just as they transformed Miriam's life. Stories that show that the supernatural never stopped happening. Stories that prove that God still does the impossible, and you can't miss it. Now, before I go, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that miracles still happen today? If you believe, comment below. I believe in the impossible. And tell me which miracle of Jesus you would like to know about in the next video. And of course, I know that this story impacted you, so leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because here we will continue exploring the lesser-known miracles of Jesus, those that few people talk about, but that carry teachings that can change lives. So click now on the next video and come with me to discover another story that few know, but that can completely change your view of faith. All this only here at the Hidden Stories of Jesus.